In this video, we will introduce Fragments Activity. Now let's take a look at our activity for our fragment. The first thing to notice is that my activity extends Fragment Activity. Fragment Activity is the base class for activities that we want to use to support fragments and loader APIs. Here I have my onCreate method. I set up my view from the main5.xml file that has my UI components. Notice that I call getResources, getConfiguration to obtain a reference to a configuration object. So we first get a reference to the configuration object, and this class describes all device configuration information that can impact the resource the application retrieves. This includes both user-specified configuration options, locale and scaling, as well as device configurations such as input modes, screen size, and screen orientation. Following that, I get Support Fragment Manager. So we call the method getSupportFragmentManager to get a reference to the Fragment Manager for interacting with fragments associated with this activity. Fragment Manager is a static library that supports version of the framework's Fragment Manager. This is used to write apps that run on platforms prior to Android 3.0. When running an Android 3.0 or above, this implementation is still used. It does not try to switch to the framework's implementation. Now I also have here a fragment transaction, and I get that by calling the fragment manager .begin transaction. When we call the begin transaction method on the fragment manager, it starts a series of edit operations on the fragments associated with this fragment manager. The static library support version of the fragments framework transaction for performing a set of fragment operations. Now I have an if-else statement. This if-else statement checks the device's orientation and acts accordingly. Here I have if config.orientation equals configuration.orientation landscape. We use the instance variable orientation, which gives us an int value representing the overall orientation of the screen. It may be one of orientation landscape, orientation portrait, and we compare this with static constant orientation landscape to check if our device is in the landscape orientation. So this can either equal orientation landscape or orientation portrait. Once this condition is met, we create our lm fragment object, and we call fragment transaction.replace. We call the replace method on the fragment transaction that replaces an existing fragment that was added to a container. We pass the container view ID, which is the identifier of the container whose fragments are to be replaced. We also pass our fragment, which is the new fragment to place in the container, which is our landscape mode fragment. Here we do the same thing in portrait mode by replacing the view with our own fragment for portrait mode. Finally, we call fragment transaction.commit. This concludes our discussion of fragments activity.